There comes a moment in your life when you realize that everything you've been doing to be seen, to be understood, to be chosen, has actually been taking you further away from your power. You've been trying to get a reaction, trying to prove your worth, trying to unlock something in someone who has already shown you, through their actions, that they are not capable of meeting you where you stand. And here's the truth that changes everything. The moment you stop trying to make them see you is the moment you finally see yourself, because your power was never in convincing them. Your power was never in waiting for them. Your power was never in decoding their silence. Your power is in what you do next. You see, an avoidant person expects something very specific from you. They expect pursuit. They expect emotional intensity. They expect you to keep showing up, keep explaining, keep giving, even when they are giving you less. That's the pattern they understand. That's the dynamic they feel safe in. So when you break that pattern, when you become calm, grounded, centered, when you stop chasing and start choosing yourself, it disrupts everything they thought they knew about you. And here's what they will not see coming. They will not see the version of you who no longer needs their validation. They will not see the version of you who walks away with dignity instead of desperation. They will not see the version of you who has outgrown the need to be chosen because you have already chosen yourself. This is not about playing games. This is not about making them jealous. This is not about proving a point. This is about reclaiming your identity. Because somewhere along the way, you made them the center of your emotional world. Their text dictated your mood. Their distance dictated your worth. Their presence felt like peace, and their absence felt like chaos. But your life was never meant to revolve around someone else's inconsistency. You are not here to be tolerated. You are not here to be half-loved. You are not here to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's emotional limitations. You are here to stand fully in who you are, without apology, without fear, without the need for permission. And when you begin to live from that place, something extraordinary happens. You stop reacting. You stop overthinking. You stop chasing. And instead you become the person who invests in their own growth. You become the person who builds a life so full, so meaningful, so aligned, that anyone who enters it must rise to meet you, or they simply won't belong there. That is your power. Not in what you say to them, not in how you get them back, but in who you become without them. Because the greatest shift you can make is realizing that the goal was never to be chosen by them. The goal is to become someone who no longer settles for anything less than what they truly deserve. And when you reach that place, whether they come back or not becomes irrelevant, because you've already won. You've been conditioned to believe that closure is something another person gives you, that if they would just explain themselves, if they would just say the right words, if they would just acknowledge your pain, then you could finally move on. But that belief is the very thing keeping you stuck. Because every time you wait for their response, you hand over your emotional authority. Every time you hope for their explanation, you delay your own healing. Closure is not something you receive, it's something you decide. And the moment you stop needing them to validate your experience, something shifts inside you. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. You begin to realize that their silence is already an answer. Their inconsistency is already clarity. Their inability to show up is already the closure you were searching for. You just didn't want to accept it because it didn't come wrapped in comfort. But here's the deeper truth. Seeking closure from someone who avoids accountability is like asking someone who cannot swim to save you from drowning. They simply don't have the capacity to give you what you're asking for. And the more you insist, the more you exhaust yourself trying to extract meaning from someone who is emotionally unavailable. So your power begins the moment you interrupt that pattern. The moment you decide, I don't need one more conversation to understand what I've already experienced. Because closure is not found in their words, it's found in your standards. It's found in your willingness to say, what I experienced was not enough for me. And that is all I need to know. You don't need them to agree. You don't need them to explain. You don't need them to suddenly become self-aware and offer you the perfect apology. That version of them, the one who gives you clarity, honesty, and emotional depth, may not exist. And waiting for that version keeps you tied to a fantasy instead of grounded in reality. When you let go of needing closure from them, you reclaim something far more valuable. Your ability to trust yourself. You start listening to your own emotions instead of questioning them. You start honoring your own experience instead of minimizing it. You stop rewriting the story to make them look better. And you start telling yourself the truth even when it's uncomfortable. And that truth is what sets you free. Because the need for closure often comes from a place of wanting to make sense of the pain. But not all pain will make sense. Some people enter your life not to give you answers, but to reveal your boundaries. To show you where you've been overgiving, where you've been overextending, where you've been accepting less than you deserve. And once you see that, the question is no longer why did they do this? The question becomes why was I willing to tolerate it for so long? That's where your growth lives. Not in analyzing their behavior, but in understanding your own patterns. Not in waiting for their explanation, but in creating your own clarity. And clarity doesn't require their participation. It requires your decision. Your decision to stop reopening a door that leads nowhere. Your decision to stop replaying conversations in your mind, hoping for a different outcome. Your decision to stop chasing a sense of peace from someone who disrupted it in the first place. Because peace is not something they can give back to you. It's something you take back the moment you stop asking for it. Detachment is often misunderstood. People hear the word and assume it means becoming cold, shutting down, pretending you don't care. But real detachment has nothing to do with pretending. It has everything to do with truth. It's the quiet, grounded decision to no longer let someone's behavior dictate your emotional state. Because for too long, your emotions have been tied to their actions. When they leaned in, you felt secure. When they pulled away, you felt anxious. When they were warm, you felt valued. When they were distant, you questioned everything about yourself. That's not connection, that's emotional dependence. Detachment is the moment you step out of that cycle. It's when you stop riding the highs and lows of their inconsistency and start standing on something solid within yourself. It doesn't mean you suddenly feel nothing. You may still care. You may still think about them. You may still have moments where you miss what you thought the relationship could be. But instead of those feelings controlling you, you begin to observe them without letting them define your actions. That's self-respect in motion, because self-respect says, even if I care, I won't abandon myself. Even if I feel something, I won't chase someone who isn't meeting me halfway. Even if this hurts, I will not lower my standards just to keep a connection alive. Detachment is choosing alignment over attachment. Attachment says, I need this person to feel okay. Alignment says, I need to feel okay, regardless of this person. And that shift changes everything. When you're attached, you tolerate behavior that doesn't serve you because you're afraid of losing them. You overthink their words. You justify their absence. You make excuses for their inconsistency. You become more focused on maintaining the connection than protecting your own peace. But when you're detached, your priorities realign. You begin to ask different questions. Not how do I keep them, but does this align with the life I want? Not what can I do to make them stay, but is this someone who deserves access to me? That's where your power starts to return. Because detachment creates space to see clearly, space to think rationally, space to reconnect with who you were before you got caught in the emotional whirlwind of trying to make this work. And in that space, you begin to recognize something important. You were giving far more than you were receiving. You were investing energy, time, and emotional depth into someone who wasn't matching you. And instead of seeing that as a reflection of your worth, you start seeing it as a misalignment. That realization is liberating, because now you're no longer trying to fix something that was never balanced to begin with. You're no longer bending yourself into shapes that make them comfortable while leaving you empty. Detachment allows you to stand still while everything else reveals itself. You don't need to chase clarity, it becomes obvious. You don't need to force answers, they show up in their absence. You don't need to fight for consistency, you recognize when it's not there. And most importantly, you stop negotiating with your own value. You no longer accept breadcrumbs when you're capable of a full, nourishing connection. You no longer settle for potential when you deserve presence. You no longer confuse intensity with intimacy. Because self-respect doesn't scream, doesn't chase, doesn't beg. It simply walks away from what doesn't meet it. And detachment is how you get there. It's easy to internalize someone else's distance as a reflection of your value. When someone pulls away, becomes inconsistent, or avoids emotional depth, your mind naturally searches for a reason, and too often, it lands on you. You start asking, what did I do wrong? What could I have done better? Why wasn't I enough for them to stay, to try, to show up fully? But that line of thinking is built on a false premise, the idea that their behavior is a measurement of your worth. It isn't. Their avoidance is a reflection of their capacity, their emotional patterns, their fears, and their level of self-awareness. It speaks to what they are able or unable to handle when it comes to closeness, vulnerability, and responsibility in a relationship. And no matter how much you give, no matter how understanding you are, no matter how patient or loving you become, you cannot expand someone else's capacity by shrinking yourself. That's the trap. You think if you just love them better, communicate more clearly, or become more accommodating, they will finally meet you where you are. But what you're really doing is trying to solve a limitation that doesn't belong to you. Avoidant behavior often comes from discomfort with emotional intimacy. When things start to deepen, when expectations become real, when vulnerability is required, they retreat not because you are too much, but because for them, closeness feels overwhelming. Instead of leaning in, they create distance. Instead of addressing issues, they shut down. Instead of building something stable, they keep things undefined. And if you don't understand this, you begin to personalize it. You interpret their withdrawal as rejection of you, rather than recognition of their own limitations. You assume that if you were different, more easygoing, less emotional, more patient, they wouldn't pull away. But that belief keeps you stuck in a cycle of self-doubt, constantly adjusting yourself to fit into a space that was never designed to hold you fully. Because here's the truth. Someone who is avoidant doesn't just struggle with you, they struggle with intimacy itself. And once you see that, something begins to shift. You stop taking their behavior so personally. You stop seeing their inconsistency as a puzzle you need to solve. You stop trying to earn a level of connection that they are not equipped to give. Instead, you begin to see the situation with clarity. This is not about your worth, this is about their readiness. And readiness cannot be forced. It cannot be negotiated, persuaded, or patiently waited into existence. A person either does the inner work required to show up in a healthy, consistent way, or they don't. And if they don't, it doesn't matter how much potential you see in them, how strong your feelings are, or how much history you share. The result will always be the same. You feeling unfulfilled, unseen, and emotionally drained. So the question stops being, why don't they choose me? And becomes, why am I choosing someone who isn't capable of choosing me fully? That's where your power begins to return. Because now, instead of trying to fix their behavior, you start honoring your own standards. You recognize that you deserve consistency, communication, and emotional presence, not as something you have to earn, but as something that should naturally exist in a healthy connection. And when you truly understand that their avoidance is about their limitations, not your inadequacy, you free yourself from the exhausting need to prove your worth to someone who was never questioning it, they were simply unable to meet it. You've been led to believe that if you just say the right thing, craft the perfect message, explain your feelings clearly enough, find the exact words to touch their heart, you can change the outcome. That communication, if done well enough, will finally break through their distance. But when you're dealing with someone who consistently avoids emotional responsibility, more words rarely create more understanding. In fact, they often do the opposite. Because when someone is already overwhelmed by emotion, depth, or expectation, your attempts to clarify, persuade, or express can feel like pressure to them. And pressure doesn't draw an avoidant person closer, it pushes them further away. This is where most people make a critical mistake. They interpret distance as a sign to try harder, to speak more, explain more, reach out more. But what they don't realize is that in doing so, they reinforce the very dynamic that keeps them stuck. You pursuing, them retreating. Silence, in this context, is not weakness. It's not giving up. It's not losing your chance. It's strength. Because choosing silence means you're no longer participating in a cycle that diminishes you. It means you're no longer trying to convince someone of your value or negotiate for basic emotional presence. It means you trust that what you've already shown through your actions, your consistency, your willingness to care is enough. And if it isn't enough for them, more words won't change that. There's a certain dignity in stepping back, in allowing space, in resisting the urge to fill every gap with explanation or emotion. Because when you stop over-communicating, something powerful happens. The reality of the situation becomes undeniable. They no longer have your constant presence to rely on. They no longer have your energy filling the silence. They no longer have your reassurance without reciprocation. And in that absence, the dynamic shifts. Not because you're trying to manipulate them, but because you're finally removing yourself from a one-sided exchange. You're no longer over-functioning in a connection where they've been under-functioning. And that creates clarity for both of you. For them, it's the first time they may truly feel your absence, not just physically, but emotionally. The safety net of your effort is gone. The Predictability of your pursuit is no longer there. And that disruption forces them to confront something they've been able to avoid: the consequences of their own inaction. For you, silence becomes a mirror. Without the constant distraction of trying to fix things, you start to see the situation for what it is. You begin to recognize patterns you may have ignored. You begin to feel the imbalance more clearly. And most importantly, you begin to reconnect with yourself. Because when you're always reaching outward, trying to bridge the gap, you lose touch with what's happening internally. Silence brings you back. It gives you space to ask, why am I working so hard for something that isn't meeting me? It gives you room to feel your emotions without immediately reacting to them. It allows you to regain your center instead of being pulled into their inconsistency. And here's the deeper truth. Silence and absence are not about making them come back. They're about you coming back to yourself. Because the moment you stop trying to control their response is the moment you start reclaiming control over your own life. You stop measuring your value by how quickly they reply or how deeply they engage. You stop waiting for their attention to feel significant. Instead, you create a life where your energy is invested in places that give back to you your growth, your passions, your peace. And from that place, whether they notice or not becomes secondary. Because you're no longer speaking to be heard by someone who isn't listening. You're choosing silence because you've finally started listening to yourself. When a relationship becomes the center of your emotional world, it's easy to lose sight of who you were before it began. Your routines start to revolve around them. Your thoughts become occupied with what they're doing, how they're feeling, whether they're coming closer or pulling away. Slowly, almost without noticing, your identity starts to merge with the connection. And when that connection becomes unstable, so do you. This is why rebuilding your identity is not just helpful, it's essential. Because the more your sense of self is tied to another person, the more power they have over your emotional state. Their presence feels like stability, and their absence feels like loss, not just of them, but of yourself. So the work now is not about fixing the relationship. It's about reconnecting with the person you've drifted away from. You. Before them, you had a life that existed independently. You had interests, routines, friendships, goals, things that brought you a sense of purpose and fulfillment. But somewhere along the way, those things may have taken a back seat. Not because you intended it, but because your focus shifted. You started investing more energy into maintaining the connection than maintaining your own foundation. And now, it's time to rebuild that foundation. Not as a distraction, not as a way to move on quickly, but as a deliberate act of self-restoration. Because your identity is not something you find, it's something you actively create through your choices. Start by asking yourself honest questions. What parts of my life have I neglected? What used to bring me energy that I've stopped prioritizing? Where have I been overinvesting in someone else at the expense of myself? These questions aren't meant to create guilt. They're meant to create awareness. Because awareness gives you the ability to choose differently. Rebuilding your identity means re-engaging with your life in a meaningful way. It means putting time and energy back into the things that make you feel alive, capable, and grounded. It could be your work, your studies, your health, your creativity, your social connections, anything that reminds you that your life is bigger than this one relationship. And as you do this, something important begins to happen. You start to feel more like yourself again. Not the version of you who was anxious, waiting, overthinking, but the version of you who is engaged, present, and self-directed. The version of you who doesn't need constant validation because your life itself becomes a source of fulfillment. This doesn't mean you won't still have moments of thinking about them. You will. But those thoughts no longer dominate your day. They become just one small part of a much larger, richer experience. And that shift changes your energy. When your identity is strong, you no longer approach relationships from a place of need. You're not looking for someone to complete you, fix you, or fill a void. You're looking for someone who complements a life that is already whole. That's a completely different dynamic. Because now, instead of asking, how do I keep them interested? You begin asking, does this person fit into the life I'm building? Instead of molding yourself to maintain connection, you stand firm in who you are and allow the right people to meet you there. Rebuilding your identity also means setting boundaries not just with them, but with yourself. It means no longer allowing your time, energy, and emotions to be consumed by something that isn't giving back to you. It means choosing where your attention goes, rather than letting it be pulled by habit or longing. And perhaps most importantly, it means rediscovering your sense of direction. Because when you're caught up in someone else, you can lose sight of where you're going. Your goals become secondary. Your growth slows down. Your world becomes smaller. But when you reclaim your identity, your world expands again. You begin to move forward not because you've forgotten them, but because you've remembered yourself. When your emotions are all over the place, your behavior follows. You send messages you later wish you hadn't. You check your phone more times than you can count. You replay conversations, searching for meaning, trying to find something you missed. And in those moments, it feels justified because you care, because you're confused, because you want clarity. But emotional impulsivity often works against you, not for you. Because when someone is avoidant, they are highly sensitive to intensity. The more reactive and emotionally charged your responses become, the more it reinforces their instinct to pull away. It creates a dynamic where your urgency meets their resistance, and that gap only widens over time. This is where emotional self-control becomes your greatest advantage. Not control in the sense of suppressing what you feel, but control in how you choose to respond to what you feel. There's a difference. You're allowed to have emotions. You're allowed to feel hurt, confused, even frustrated. But you're also capable of deciding what you do with those emotions, instead of letting them dictate your behavior in the moment. Because not every feeling requires an immediate reaction. In fact, the strongest position you can take is often the one where you pause, where you give yourself space before responding, where you allow the initial wave of emotion to pass before you decide what action, if any, is actually aligned with your self-respect. This pause is powerful. It interrupts the cycle of reacting out of anxiety. It prevents you from over-explaining, over-giving, or overextending in moments where you're not grounded. And it gives you the clarity to ask yourself a different question, not, how do I get them to respond? But what response reflects the person I want to be? That's where your power begins to show. Because when you're emotionally grounded, your energy changes. You're no longer chasing reassurance or trying to force connection. You're steady. You're composed. You're not easily shaken by their inconsistency. And that steadiness creates something unexpected. Intrigue. Not because you're trying to play a role or act indifferent, but because your behavior no longer fits the pattern they're used to. They're used to emotional reactions. They're used to you filling the silence, reaching out, trying to fix things. But when you stop doing that, when you become more measured, more intentional, it disrupts their expectations. And people notice what changes. They notice when you're no longer as available. They notice when you're not reacting the same way. They notice when your attention is no longer centered around them. But this isn't about making them notice. It's about becoming someone who doesn't lose themselves in moments of emotional pressure. Because emotional self-control is not just attractive, it's stabilizing. It allows you to stay aligned with your values even when your feelings are pulling you in different directions. It helps you maintain your standards instead of lowering them in moments of vulnerability. And over time, it builds something far more important than any reaction from them: self-trust. You begin to trust that no matter what happens, whether they reach out or stay distant, you will handle it in a way that protects your peace. You won't abandon yourself for the sake of connection. You won't compromise your dignity just to feel temporarily reassured. That kind of stability is rare, because most people are driven by immediate emotion. They react first and reflect later. But when you reverse that, when you reflect first and respond second, you separate yourself from the chaos. You become someone who moves with intention rather than impulse. And in doing so, you change the entire dynamic. Not by controlling them, but by mastering yourself. For a long time, you may have believed that the most powerful thing you could do was get a reaction from them. Make them miss you. Make them regret losing you. Make them finally realize what they had. It feels like if you could just surprise them with the right words, the right message, the right version of yourself, something would click. But that mindset keeps your focus exactly where it's always been, on them. And as long as your energy is invested in trying to create a reaction, you remain tied to the outcome of someone else's perception. Whether they notice, whether they care, whether they respond, it all continues to define how you feel. Real power doesn't work like that. The ultimate surprise is not something you do to them. It's something you become for yourself. Because when you stop performing, stop proving, stop trying to influence how they see you, you will stop being influenced by you. You free up an incredible amount of energy that was once spent analyzing their behavior, anticipating their responses, and trying to control the narrative. And now, that energy has somewhere new to go. Your growth. Transformation is quiet at first. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't seek validation. It happens in the small, consistent choices you make every day. The choice to focus on your own path instead of their attention. The choice to invest in your well-being instead of their approval. The choice to move forward even when part of you still feels pulled back. And over time, those choices reshape you. You begin to carry yourself differently. There's a groundedness in you that wasn't there before. A sense of direction that doesn't depend on anyone else's involvement. You're no longer waiting to be chosen, you're actively choosing the life you want to live. That's the shift they don't see coming. Because they're used to the version of you who was emotionally available to them in a way that cost you your peace. They're used to the version of you who showed up no matter what, who gave even when it wasn't reciprocated, who stayed even when things were unclear. But when you evolve, that version no longer exists. And it's not because you've become cold or distant. It's because you've become clear. Clear about what you deserve. Clear about what you will and won't tolerate. Clear about the kind of connection you're willing to invest in. That clarity changes how you show up. You're no longer easily pulled back in by inconsistent effort. You're no longer impressed by minimal gestures. You're no longer willing to reopen doors that once led to confusion and imbalance. And here's the key. You don't need to announce any of this. You don't need to explain your growth. You don't need to prove that you've changed. You don't need to show them what they lost. Because real transformation is felt, not declared. It's seen in your absence where you once would have stayed. It's seen in your silence where you once would have explained. It's seen in your standards where you once would have compromised. And whether they recognize it or not becomes irrelevant. Because the goal is no longer to create an impact on them. The goal is to create a life that reflects your true value, a life where your energy is invested in people and experiences that align with who you are now, not who you were when you were trying to make something work that wasn't working. This is what taking your power back actually looks like. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It doesn't seek attention. It's a quiet, unwavering commitment to yourself. A decision that no matter what happens, you will continue to grow, continue to evolve, and continue to move forward, not as a reaction to them, but as a reflection of who you've chosen to become. Thank you for being here and investing in your growth. It truly matters. Goodbye for now, and may you keep choosing yourself every step of the way.